when a single human warship emerged from the void at the edge of Imperial space. Every government in the galaxy realized their greatest fear had finally come true. The detection happened at 0400 station time aboard Listening Post Epsilon 9, a remote monitoring facility orbiting a dying star at the border of the Valtharian Empire. The sensor operator, a veteran of 3 decades watching empty space, nearly dropped his morning stimulant when his console erupted in warnings. The signature was impossible. Mass readings suggested something the size of a small moon. Energy output exceeded anything in the Imperial fleet by a factor of 10. But what sent ice through his blood was the identification beacon, broadcasting clear as daylight in a language the galaxy hadn't heard in over 15 years. Human. Within minutes, the emergency transmission reached the Imperial Council chamber, interrupting a heated debate about trade tariffs. The senior admiral, a towering figure whose family had commanded fleets for 6 generations, stood frozen as he processed the report. His scales, normally a proud crimson, paled to pink. Around the circular chamber, representatives from 47 species fell silent. The temperature seemed to drop, because everyone in that room remembered what humans were capable of when they decided to go to war. 15 years ago, humanity had vanished. Not slowly, not with fanfare, but overnight. Their colonies went dark. Their trading posts closed. Their diplomatic channels shut down. The few human vessels still traveling known space turned around mid-journey and disappeared into the black. The galaxy had theories, of course. Some said internal collapse. Others whispered about a plague. The optimists suggested they'd simply decided isolation was safer than dealing with the complex web of galactic politics. But no one knew for certain. And now, after 15 years of silence, they were back with a warship that made the Empire's most powerful dreadnoughts look like patrol boats. The captain of that human vessel sent only one message after entering Imperial space. It was polite, almost friendly, but the words carried weight that made seasoned military commanders reconsider their entire careers. The message requested safe passage through the sector. Nothing more. No demands. No threats. Just a simple request delivered with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding all the power in a negotiation. The captain didn't need to threaten. The ship itself was the threat. Every skin revealed new terrors. Weapon systems using principles Imperial scientists couldn't identify. Hull plating that seemed to absorb incoming fire like water. And something else, something the sensors couldn't quite pin down, that suggested this vessel was just the beginning. The Empire prided itself on strength. For 3,000 years, they had maintained order across 200 systems through military might and political cunning. Their fleets numbered in the thousands. Their technology was considered the pinnacle of galactic engineering. But the presence of this one human ship shattered that confidence like glass. Because if humanity could build one of these in secret, how many more were waiting in whatever corner of space they'd hidden themselves? And more terrifying, what had they been doing for 15 years while the galaxy forgot about them? The council convened an emergency session. The diplomatic envoy argued for immediate contact, hoping to understand human intentions before assuming hostility. The military chief wanted to mobilize the fleet, to show strength and deter any aggressive action. The science minister demanded sensor data, desperate to understand the technology gap that had somehow opened while everyone looked away. But it was the historian, an elderly scholar who rarely spoke, who silenced them all with a single observation. Humans, she reminded them, had never started a war they didn't win. Not once in their entire recorded history. They might lose battles, suffer setbacks, endure terrible losses, but in the end, they always found a way to achieve their objectives. And they'd had 15 years to prepare for something. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. Species that had once traded with humanity scrambled to locate old contact protocols. Governments that had claimed human territory after their disappearance suddenly found those claims feeling very tenuous. Military analysts pulled decades-old files, trying to remember lessons learned from humanity's previous conflicts. And everywhere, the same questions echoed through 1,000 different languages. Where had they been? What had they built? And most importantly, why had they come back now? The human battleship continued its journey through Imperial space, maintaining course, responding to traffic control with mechanical precision, and ignoring every attempt at deeper communication. It wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It was simply there, moving with purpose toward some unknown destination, and there wasn't a force in the galaxy confident enough to try stopping it, because stopping it would require knowing you could win. And right now, looking at that ship, at the casual display of technological superiority, at the calm certainty radiating from every transmission, no one was sure of anything anymore. The commander of the Imperial Home Fleet sat in his private quarters that night, staring at tactical displays that suddenly seemed obsolete. He'd built his career on understanding threats, on knowing his enemy, on calculating odds. But how do you calculate against an unknown? How do you defend against technology you can't understand? How do you negotiate with a species that might have just made your entire military irrelevant? And then, just as panic was reaching its peak, just as governments were mobilizing and old alliances were reforming, the human ship did something that changed everything. It stopped. Not at a station. Not at a designated coordinate. The massive vessel simply halted in the middle of nowhere, in a stretch of space so unremarkable that most navigation charts didn't even bother labeling it. The ship's engines powered down to minimal output. Its weapon systems went dormant. And then it waited. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than any show of force could have been. The intelligence director of the Galactic Security Council spent 3 sleepless nights trying to understand the logic. Every military doctrine they'd ever studied said that momentum was crucial. You didn't stop in enemy territory. You didn't make yourself a stationary target. You didn't give your opposition time to plan, to coordinate, to gather forces. But humans had never followed standard military doctrine. They wrote their own rules, usually in ways that made sense only after the battle was over and you were counting your losses. What the galaxy didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that humanity had been watching. For 15 years, every transmission, every political maneuvering, every shift in power had been monitored from the shadows. Human listening posts, so advanced they were invisible to conventional scans, had been cataloging everything. The great galactic powers thought they were alone in their deliberations, but humanity had been taking notes. They knew which alliances were genuine and which were convenient. They knew which governments were stable and which were one crisis away from collapse. And most importantly, they knew exactly what had happened after they left. The young recruit aboard the human battleship stood at her post in the observation deck, watching the emptiness of space with eyes that had never seen Earth. She was born in the isolation, in the hidden systems where humanity had rebuilt itself away from galactic eyes. Her parents had told her stories about the old days, about markets where 100 species traded goods, about diplomatic halls where humanity had a voice. But those were just stories to her generation. They'd grown up preparing for something else, training for a purpose that the adults spoke about in hushed, determined tones. Looking at the massive ship around her, at the technology that seemed almost magical compared to what the history files showed, she finally understood what 15 years of focused determination could accomplish. Back at Imperial Command, the strategic analyst was presenting findings that made the assembled military leaders physically uncomfortable. The data was clear. Humanity hadn't just been hiding. They'd been testing. Small probes, almost impossible to detect, had been slipping through Imperial space for years, mapping defenses, cataloging fleet positions, studying response times. The Empire had thought they were secure, their borders monitored, their space controlled. But humanity had been walking through their house, counting exits, noting where they kept the weapons. The violation of it made the Supreme Commander want to order immediate retaliation. But retaliation against what? A ship that was just sitting there? A species that had technically broken no laws? The merchant captain, representing the trade coalition, stood before the council with the perspective no one wanted to hear. She'd done business with humans before the silence, had even called a few of them friends. And she remembered something that the military types seemed to have forgotten in their panic. Humans didn't show force without reason. They didn't waste resources on displays of power just to intimidate. Every action they took served a purpose, often multiple purposes simultaneously. This ship, this massive declaration of capability, was a message. But to understand a message, You had to understand what humans valued, and what they valued, above all else, was being left alone to protect their own. That's when the second piece of the puzzle emerged from the intelligence archives. The junior analyst, working through old files that everyone assumed were irrelevant, found something that should have been flagged years ago. 3 months before humanity went silent, there had been an incident. A human colony on the frontier had gone dark. Not unusual by itself. Colonies had problems, but the investigation had been sloppy. The local authorities had ruled it a technical failure and moved on. No follow-up, no real inquiry. And now, looking at it with fresh eyes and the context of everything that followed, it was obvious. That colony hadn't failed. It had been attacked. The room went cold when the senior investigator presented the evidence to the full council. Burn patterns consistent with military-grade weapons, debris showing signs of forced entry, and most damning, a data fragment recovered from a destroyed satellite that showed unknown ships in orbit hours before the colony's last transmission. Someone had hit a human settlement, killed civilians, and then covered it up so well that even humanity's own investigators had missed it initially. But humans were thorough. They might have missed it at first, but eventually, they would have found the truth. And when they did, when they realized that someone had murdered their people and gotten away with it, they hadn't demanded justice through diplomatic channels. They'd simply vanished to prepare for getting justice their own way. The veteran peacekeeper, who'd spent 40 years trying to prevent wars, felt sick, because now the math was simple and terrible. An unknown enemy had struck at humanity. Humanity had spent 15 years finding out who and building the tools to respond. And now they were back, not to conquer, not to claim territory, but to settle a debt. The battleship wasn't an invasion force. It was a statement. It was humanity announcing that they'd figured out what happened. They knew who was responsible, and they were done being the victims. Across the galaxy, governments began frantically reviewing their own records. Had any of their ships been near that colony? Had any of their allies been involved? The paranoia spread like poison. Ancient rivalries flared up as species accused each other of bringing humanity's wrath down upon them all. Because that was the genius of it. Humanity didn't have to fire a shot. They just had to exist, to be present, to let everyone's guilty conscience do the work. The crown princess of the Talvarian dynasty, who'd been only a child when humans disappeared, sat in her private chambers reading everything she could find about human warfare. Her tutors had taught her that victory came from superior numbers or superior technology. But humans had something else. They had patience. They could take a wound, retreat, endure years of hardship, and come back stronger. They turned their defeats into lessons and their losses into motivation. And they never, ever forgot someone who hurt them. The waiting continued. The human ship sat in space like a judge, waiting for the guilty party to step forward. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, humanity's true fleet remained hidden, watching to see who would break first, who would reveal themselves, who would make the mistake of thinking this was just about one ship and not about the entire terrifying weight of a species that had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment. Then, on the 7th day of the standoff, a message arrived at Imperial Command from a source that made everyone's blood run cold. The transmission came from the outer reaches, from a mining consortium that had been operating in unclaimed space for decades. Their message was simple but devastating. They'd found something, a debris field, old wreckage that their salvage teams had stumbled across while charting new asteroid clusters. And buried in that wreckage were identification codes that matched the missing human colony. But that wasn't the worst part. The weapons' signatures, the tactical patterns, the residue from the attack. It all pointed to military-grade equipment. Professional work. Not pirates. Not raiders. Someone with resources and training had systematically eliminated every human on that settlement. The forensic specialist who analyzed the data felt her hands shaking as she compiled the report. She'd seen combat before, survived 2 wars, thought she was beyond being shocked by violence. But there was something cold about this. The attack had been thorough. Methodical. Every escape pod destroyed. Every distress beacon jammed. Every witness silenced. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted the colony gone. They'd wanted to erase any trace of what happened, and they'd almost succeeded. Almost. Because humans had a saying that the rest of the galaxy was about to understand. They didn't forgive, and they definitely didn't forget. The council chamber erupted into chaos when the findings were presented. Species accused each other. Old tensions flared. The diplomatic corps tried to maintain order, but fear had taken hold, because now everyone understood what the human battleship represented. It wasn't a random show of force. It was a hunter circling its prey. And somewhere in this room, or in the governments represented here, was the entity responsible for that massacre. The humans knew who it was. They had to know. That's why they were here, waiting, watching to see who would panic first. The military attaché from the Korvax Federation stood alone in his quarters that night, staring at classified files he'd hoped would never matter again. His government had been expanding aggressively 15 years ago, taking territory, pushing boundaries. They'd clashed with several species over resource rights and trade routes. Had any of those conflicts involved humans? He couldn't remember. The Korvax military ran dozens of operations simultaneously back then. Border skirmishes were common. But now, with humanity's battleship sitting like a loaded weapon in Imperial space, every past action felt like a potential death sentence. What terrified the galaxy most wasn't just the ship's power. It was the implications behind it. Humanity had gone dark with maybe 100 vessels, decent technology, but nothing revolutionary, and a military that was respected but not feared. They'd been players in galactic politics, but not dominant ones. Now they returned with a single ship that outclassed everything in known space, which meant somewhere in the dark, they'd built shipyards, developed new weapons, created an entire industrial infrastructure without anyone noticing. How many more ships were waiting? How many soldiers had they trained? What other technological leaps had they achieved? The science delegation from the academic collective had been studying the sensor data obsessively, and their conclusions were both fascinating and horrifying. Human technology had taken a completely different evolutionary path. While the rest of the galaxy had been refining existing principles, making incremental improvements to proven designs, humanity had thrown out the playbook entirely. Their ship used power generation systems that shouldn't be possible according to conventional physics. Their weapons operated on principles that made senior physicists question their entire education, and their defensive capabilities seemed to border on manipulation of space-time itself. 15 years of isolation had produced a technological revolution that put them decades, maybe centuries, ahead of everyone else. The junior officer monitoring communications detected something strange on the 8th day. The human ship, which had been silent except for basic navigational responses, had begun transmitting data, not to anyone specific, just broadcasting into space. At first, it seemed like random noise, but the cryptography team quickly realized it was encoded information, files, records, evidence. The humans were dumping everything they'd collected over 15 years. Every transaction they'd monitored, every secret they'd uncovered, every lie they'd cataloged. It was psychological warfare at its finest. They were showing the galaxy exactly how much they knew, how thoroughly they'd been watching, how completely they'd penetrated every government's supposed security. The Undersecretary of Colonial Affairs recognized one of the intercepted documents and nearly collapsed. It was an internal memo from his own department, sent years ago through supposedly secure channels. The humans had it. They'd been reading classified Imperial communications the entire time, which meant they knew about the backroom deals, the illegal weapons sales, the territory grabs disguised as humanitarian missions. Every dirty secret that governments kept hidden from their own people was now potentially in human hands. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that traditional military might suddenly seem irrelevant. You couldn't threaten someone who could expose your every crime to your own citizens. The resistance leader, operating from shadows in a contested system, saw opportunity in this chaos. Her people had been fighting against imperial oppression for decades, with limited success. But now, with humanity's return, the calculus had changed. If humans were angry enough to deploy their new military might, they might be convinced to oppose other injustices too. Or at the very least, their presence would distract imperial forces enough for resistance movements to gain ground. She drafted a message to the human ship, knowing it was risky, but hoping that humanity remembered what it was like to fight for freedom against overwhelming odds. The ship's chaplain, serving with the Imperial Navy, struggled with questions his faith couldn't easily answer. He'd always preached that strength came from righteousness, that good would triumph over evil. But what did it mean when a wrong party returned with overwhelming force? Were the humans righteous in their anger? Was vengeance ever justified? And what happened to everyone caught in the middle when two powerful forces collided? His congregation of soldiers looked to him for guidance, but for the first time in his career, he had no comforting words to offer. On the human battleship, the navigation officer checked their coordinates for the 100th time. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The waiting wasn't random. They were giving the galaxy time to understand, time to fear, time to recognize that humanity's patience had limits, and those limits had been exceeded. Every hour that passed, more species remembered old dealings, questioned past actions, wondered if they'd unknowingly contributed to the chain of events that led to this moment. The psychological pressure was building, and eventually, someone would crack. The ancient historian, one of the galaxy's foremost experts on warfare, published an analysis that went viral across every major network. She'd studied human conflicts throughout their known history and found a pattern that chilled her. Humans could be peaceful. They could be diplomatic. They could coexist and cooperate with remarkable grace. But there was a line, and when someone crossed it, when someone attacked their families, their homes, their children, humanity transformed into something relentless. They would sacrifice everything, endure any hardship, pay any price to achieve justice for their fallen. And they were approaching now not as conquerors, but as collectors of a debt written in innocent blood. The waiting continued into the second week, and with each passing day, the galaxy's confidence crumbled a little more, while humanity's message became clearer. We know what you did. We know who did it, and we're giving you one chance to make this right before we do it ourselves. Then everything changed when the prisoners started talking. Nobody had expected this. Deep in the maximum security detention center on the Imperial capital world, an inmate who'd been locked away for 12 years suddenly requested an audience with the High Council. The prisoner wasn't just anyone. Before incarceration, they'd been a decorated fleet commander, responsible for dozens of successful military operations. Their fall from grace had been spectacular, convicted of unauthorized weapons trafficking and misuse of military assets. But now, watching the news feeds about the human battleship, the prisoner had information that could either save the Empire or doom it entirely. The emergency session was called at midnight. Council members arrived in various states of undress and panic, uncertain why they'd been summoned with such urgency. The chamber guard brought the prisoner in wearing restraints that seemed excessive until you remembered what they'd been capable of before imprisonment. The prisoner looked older, worn by years in isolation, but their eyes held a clarity that made the assembled leaders uncomfortable. They knew something that couldn't wait even one more hour. The prisoner's testimony started slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the words themselves carried physical weight. 12 years ago, there had been a black operations unit, unofficial, funded through dark budgets and operated with complete deniability. Their mission was simple: eliminate potential threats to Imperial expansion before those threats became actual problems. Target small, isolated settlements. Make it look like accidents or technical failures. Remove obstacles quietly so the Empire could grow without messy diplomatic incidents. The prisoner had commanded 3 such operations before their conscience finally broke, and they tried to expose the program. That's when they'd been arrested, charged with crimes that were real but minor compared to what they'd witnessed, and buried so deep in the prison system that no one would ever hear their story. The council sat in stunned silence. The Chief Justice wanted to dismiss it as the desperate lies of a convicted criminal seeking reduced sentence. But the prisoner had details, dates, coordinates, authorization codes, and when they mentioned a small human colony in the frontier regions, a settlement that officially failed due to life support malfunction, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The operation had been textbook. Quick strike, total elimination, cover-up so complete that even human investigators had initially accepted the accident explanation. It should have been perfect. Should have been forgotten. But the prisoner revealed something that made the situation infinitely worse. They weren't the only unit. The Black Operations program had at least 4 other teams, maybe more. And the human colony wasn't their only target. Over a period of 5 years, dozens of settlements from various species had been quietly erased. Always on the frontier. Always in locations where the Empire wanted to expand but couldn't openly justify military action. The architects of this program had been playing a long game, removing obstacles piece by piece, letting the Empire grow while maintaining plausible deniability. And now, one of those victims had returned with the power to make everyone pay. The military prosecutor started pulling files immediately. If what the prisoner claimed was true, this went beyond war crimes. This was systematic genocide dressed up as accidents. And the authorization codes the prisoner provided pointed to someone still in power. Someone sitting in the council itself. The paranoia that had been building for 2 weeks suddenly found focus. Every council member was looking at their colleagues with suspicion. Who had signed off on these operations? Who had funded them? Who had the authority to make entire populations disappear? The intelligence chief realized the tactical nightmare they were facing. Humanity probably didn't know about the other operations yet. They'd focused on finding justice for their own people. But if they learned that the same program had targeted dozens of other species, if they shared that information with the galaxy, the Empire wouldn't just face one angry species. They'd face a coalition of the wronged. Every government that had lost frontier colonies to mysterious accidents would suddenly have answers and someone to blame. The Empire's carefully maintained position as galactic stabilizer would shatter overnight. The young senator, who'd built her career on transparency and reform, felt physically sick. She'd campaigned on rooting out corruption, on bringing honor back to imperial governance. She'd thought she was fighting against bureaucratic waste and minor graft. Now she understood the corruption went so much deeper. People had been murdered. Families had been erased. And the machinery of government had been used to cover it up. Everything she believed about the Empire's nobility felt like naive delusion. How do you reform a system that's built on hidden mass graves? The prisoner dropped the final revelation with the exhausted air of someone unburdening their soul. The operations had been supervised by someone known only as the architect. Nobody in the field units ever met them directly. Orders came through encrypted channels. Payments appeared in untraceable accounts. But the prisoner had seen something once, a partial communication log that suggested the architect wasn't military. They were civilian, someone with political power and resources who saw the Black Operations program as necessary for imperial greatness. And they were still out there, still in power, still protected by layers of deniability and official secrecy. The council realized they had perhaps hours before humanity's patience ran out. They could try to find the architect, expose the conspiracy, offer justice to the humans. Or they could try to cover it up, discredit the prisoner, and hope humanity's evidence wasn't as complete as their confidence suggested. Every choice led down a dark path. Confession meant admitting to atrocities that would end careers and possibly topple the government. Denial meant going to war with a species that had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this scenario. The encrypted message arrived at the human battleship during this chaos, sent from an anonymous source within the imperial government itself. Someone with access to the council's emergency session. Someone who'd heard the prisoner's testimony and decided that humanity deserved to know the full truth. The message contained everything. Names, evidence, financial records, and most damning of all, it revealed that the attack on the human colony had been just one operation in a program that had killed thousands across multiple species. Humanity's tragedy was part of something much larger, much more evil. The captain of the human battleship read the intelligence report with an expression that made the bridge crew nervous. They'd come seeking justice for their own people. Now they held evidence of crimes that stretched across the galaxy. The mission parameters had just expanded dramatically, and somewhere in the hidden fleet waiting in the dark, commanders were receiving new orders that would change everything. The communications officer on the battleship began broadcasting a new message, this time not to governments, but directly to every major media network in known space. And what humanity was about to reveal would shake the foundations of galactic civilization itself. The broadcast went live across 47 systems simultaneously. No government could block it. No military could jam it. Humanity had spent 15 years learning how to ensure their message would be heard. And now billions of citizens across the galaxy watched as the human ambassador appeared on their screens. Not a military officer. Not a politician. Just someone who spoke with the quiet authority of representing an entire species that had been wronged. The ambassador's face showed no anger, no hatred, just a tired determination that somehow felt more threatening than any battle cry. The evidence humanity presented was devastating in its completeness. Financial records showing funds diverted to black operations. Communications proving coordination at the highest levels of imperial government. Testimonies from the prisoner and 3 other operatives who'd been located in exile, living with guilt they could no longer carry. And forensic evidence from not just a human colony, but 17 other settlements across 8 species, all destroyed by the same program. Humanity didn't just expose what happened to their people. They exposed a conspiracy that had been murdering innocents across the galaxy for profit and territorial expansion. But then came the twist that nobody saw coming. The human ambassador revealed that humanity had known most of this information for over a year. They'd uncovered the conspiracy, identified the responsible parties, tracked down the architect. They could have struck immediately, could have used their new military might to extract revenge while the galaxy was unprepared. Instead, they'd done something that seemed incomprehensible to military strategists watching. They'd waited. They'd gathered more evidence. They'd reached out quietly to other victim species, to resistance movements, to anyone who'd suffered under the Empire's hidden brutality. And they'd built something unprecedented. The screen split to show not just the one human battleship in Imperial space, but representatives from 15 different species. The coordinator of the coalition spoke first, a survivor from one of the destroyed settlements, their voice shaking with emotion. Humanity had offered them something no one else could. Proof of what had happened and allies strong enough to demand justice. This wasn't a human invasion. This was a liberation movement. Every species in the coalition had lost people to the Black Operations program. Everyone had been dismissed, told their losses were accidents, forced to grieve without answers. Now they had answers, and they had humanity's technological might backing their demand for accountability. The Empire faced a choice that was no choice at all. Fight a coalition of wronged species backed by human military superiority, or surrender those responsible for judgment. The military high command ran simulations, and the results were unanimous. They couldn't win. Not against human technology. Not against a unified coalition motivated by justified rage. The equations were brutal. Estimated casualties, millions. Estimated chance of victory, negligible. Estimated cost of resistance, the complete destruction of imperial civilization. The senior admiral, who commanded fleets for 40 years, made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered stand down. Not surrender, but something more painful. Compliance. Within hours, Imperial security forces were arresting high-ranking officials. The warrants came with evidence so damning that even the most loyal supporters couldn't deny the truth. Ministers, generals, intelligence chiefs, all taken into custody while the galaxy watched in real time. The mighty empire that had maintained order for millennia was tearing itself apart from within, and humanity hadn't fired a single shot. But the architect remained elusive. Every lead ended at dead drops and encrypted channels. The person who'd orchestrated years of genocide had built perfect deniability, until the young senator, driven by guilt and determination, followed a hunch that her colleagues had dismissed. She cross-referenced the authorization codes with attendance records from classified security briefings. Most officials attended regularly, but one person had perfect attendance at every single meeting where black operations were discussed, yet never appeared in any communication logs. They'd been in the room for every decision but left no paper trail. The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber when the young senator presented her findings. The architect wasn't a shadowy military figure or a corrupt intelligence official. It was the Treasury Minister, a bureaucrat considered so boring and unremarkable that nobody had ever suspected them of anything beyond balancing budgets. For 15 years, they'd used their position controlling imperial finances to fund and direct the operations, always careful to never communicate directly, to never leave evidence, to hide behind layers of deniability. Their motive was simple and chilling. They believed the empire needed to expand to survive, and moral concerns were obstacles to be overcome. The arrest was broadcast across every network. The Treasury Minister showed no remorse, even seemed proud of their efficiency. They'd eliminated obstacles to imperial growth. They'd done what was necessary. The fact that those obstacles were living beings with families and futures meant nothing to them. It was just math, just resource allocation, just necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Their calm justification of mass murder was perhaps more horrifying than any rage-filled confession could have been. The trial was swift, not in imperial courts, but in a new tribunal established by the coalition. Judges from every victim species presided. Evidence was presented with clinical precision. The Treasury Minister was convicted of crimes against civilization itself. The sentence was exile to a remote monitoring station where they would spend the rest of their life, watching the civilizations they tried to destroy, rebuild, and thrive. Death would have been easier. This way, they'd live with the knowledge that everything they'd done had achieved nothing except their own destruction. The Empire's government collapsed within weeks, not violently, but through a peaceful dissolution voted on by member species who no longer trusted central authority. The coalition of the wronged, as they'd become known, formed the basis of a new galactic organization, one founded on transparency, on accountability, on the principle that power without oversight leads to atrocities. And at the center of this new order, by unanimous vote of all founding members, stood humanity. The unexpected twist came during the formation ceremony. The human ambassador, speaking before assembled representatives from across the galaxy, declined the leadership position. Humanity didn't want to rule. They'd never wanted power over others. They'd returned not to dominate, but to ensure that what happened to their people, to all the victims, would never happen again. Instead, they proposed a rotating council, a shared authority where no single species could make decisions that affected everyone. They'd built a coalition not to lead it, but to ensure justice was possible. The former prisoner, now pardoned and appointed to the new Security Oversight Committee, watched the ceremony with tears streaming down their face. 12 years ago, they tried to expose the truth and been destroyed for it. Now that truth had reshaped the galaxy. Their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. The innocent people they'd failed to save hadn't been forgotten. And the system that had enabled such evil was being replaced by something better. The human battleship, its mission complete, prepared to depart Imperial space. But as the crew began final preparations, sensors detected something that made the captain's blood run cold. 15 unidentified vessels had just emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, and their signatures matched nothing in any known database. For 3 tense minutes, every military installation in the system went to high alert. The coalition forces scrambled. Imperial remnants powered up what weapons they had left. Everyone assumed this was retaliation, some hidden Imperial faction coming for revenge. But the captain of the human battleship did something that surprised everyone. They smiled. Then they opened a communication channel and said simply, "Welcome home." The 15 vessels were human. Not warships, but colony transports, medical frigates, and construction carriers. The hidden fleet that everyone had feared wasn't a massive military armada. It was humanity's future. Families, engineers, teachers, scientists, doctors, artists. For 15 years, humanity hadn't just been building weapons. They'd been building a civilization capable of surviving anything. The battleship had been their sword, yes, but these ships represented their shield and their hope. They'd prepared for war, but never stopped planning for peace. The revelation shifted something fundamental in how the galaxy understood humanity. They weren't conquerors who happened to seek justice. They were survivors who would fight when necessary, but preferred to build. The single battleship had been enough because it was never meant to destroy the Empire. It was meant to make sure that when humanity revealed the truth, people would listen. The show of force had been a guarantee of attention, not a promise of destruction. And now, with justice achieved, humanity was ready to move forward. The young recruit from the battleship transferred to one of the colony ships, her combat duty complete. She'd trained for war her entire life, but now she'd helped build settlements on frontier worlds that the new coalition government had offered humanity. Her generation had grown up preparing for revenge, but they'd get to live building something better. She thought about the human colony that had been destroyed, the innocent people whose deaths had started this entire journey. They couldn't be brought back, but they could be honored by ensuring their tragedy led to lasting change. The medical officer aboard one of the frigates began coordinating with the coalition's health services. 15 years of isolation had forced humanity to make breakthroughs in medicine, in trauma treatment, in psychological healing. Now they could share that knowledge. The galaxy had victims beyond those killed in the black operations, soldiers who'd fought in unjust wars, civilians traumatized by imperial oppression, refugees from collapsed governments. Humanity's healers would help them all, not because it gave humanity power, but because healing was what you did when the fighting stopped. The former imperial admiral, who'd ordered the stand down, met with the human ambassador in a private conference. The conversation was difficult, full of painful acknowledgments and hard truths. The admiral admitted that he'd known something was wrong for years, but had looked away, telling himself he was following orders and maintaining stability. The ambassador listened without judgment, then offered something unexpected: a position in the new coalition's defense force, not as a leader, but as someone who understood the old system's failures and could help prevent new ones. Redemption through service. The admiral accepted, knowing he'd spend the rest of his life working to balance the scales. The merchant captain, who'd done business with humans before their disappearance, reopened trade negotiations with a joy she didn't bother hiding. She'd mourned when humanity went silent, lost friends she'd valued. Now those connections could be rebuilt. Trade routes reopened. Cultural exchanges resumed. She knew it would take time for trust to fully return, but the foundation was there. Humanity remembered who'd been fair in their dealings before, who treated them as equals rather than opportunities. Those relationships would be honored in the new era. The resistance leader, whose movement had been struggling for decades, found herself working alongside former imperial officials in the coalition government. It was strange sitting in meetings with people she'd once fought against. But the new system made it possible. Power was distributed. Voices were heard. The checks and balances that humanity had insisted on meant that no single faction could dominate. It wasn't perfect. Democracy never was. But it was better than what came before, and it gave her people hope that real change was possible. The ancient historian published her final analysis of the crisis, and it became required reading across the new coalition. She wrote about how humanity's response had been unconventional, but ultimately more effective than traditional military conquest. They'd weaponized truth instead of just relying on force. They'd built alliances instead of demanding submission. They'd shown that real power wasn't about who had the biggest fleet, but who could inspire others to stand together for something meaningful. The galaxy had learned that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their military capability. It was their refusal to become the monsters they fought against. The ship's chaplain held a memorial service broadcast across the coalition. Representatives from every victim species attended, lighting candles for the lost. The human colonists who died 15 years ago. The thousands from other species, murdered by the Black Operations Program. The soldiers on all sides who'd fallen in conflicts that should never have happened. The chaplain spoke about how grief could transform into either bitterness or purpose, and how humanity had chosen purpose. The loss would never stop hurting, but it could mean something. It could be the foundation of a better future. The captain of the human battleship stood on the bridge one final time before transferring command to the Coalition Defense Force. The massive vessel would remain as a reminder and a deterrent. Other species would study its technology, learn from humanity's advances, and hopefully never need to use them. The captain thought about the journey that had brought them here. 15 years of preparation, weeks of tense standoff, and ultimately, victory achieved not through destruction, but through courage to tell the truth and faith that others would listen. The young senator, who'd helped expose the architect, was elected to the coalition's governing council by overwhelming majority. She'd proven that integrity mattered, that one person willing to follow evidence, wherever it led, could change everything. She carried the weight of that responsibility seriously, knowing that the new system was fragile. It would take constant work to maintain, constant vigilance to prevent new corruptions. But for the first time in her life, she believed that work was possible. As human ships dispersed to their new homes across coalition space, the human ambassador gave a final address that would be remembered for generations. They spoke about how humanity had been given a choice after their people were murdered. They could have sought revenge and become destroyers. Instead, they'd chosen to be builders. They turned their pain into purpose, their anger into action for justice rather than vengeance. The galaxy was imperfect, and humanity was part of that imperfection. But together, all species could work toward something better. Not a perfect civilization, but one that tried. One that held itself accountable. One where the powerful couldn't commit atrocities and hide behind lies. The human battleship jumped to hyperspace, heading toward new frontier worlds where humanity would build settlements alongside dozens of other species. The era of isolated empires was ending. The age of coalition, of shared governance, of accountability, was beginning. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and challenges. But humanity had proven something important. That victims didn't have to become victimizers. That the wrong could seek justice without becoming tyrants. That real strength wasn't about dominating others, but about having the courage to stand for what was right even when it was difficult. The galaxy would never forget what humanity had done, not with force, but with truth. And in the end, that made all the difference.